Welcome to the Counterpoint podcast, everyone. My name is Peter Richardson, one of the research directors at Counterpoint, and I'm joined today by Brady Wong, who's an associate director. Hello, Brady. How are you doing today?
I'm okay. It's a good day.
Great. Good to hear your voice, Brady. So there's been quite a bit happening this week, and we're going to be talking through some of the changes that the US Commerce Department has made in amending their export rules, which seem to be designed to specifically target Huawei and Huawei's ability to use US technology and software in the design and manufacturing of semiconductors outside of the US, which is a pretty significant extension in the what they previously announced relative to the entity list just about a year ago. So, our intention here is to kind of talk through the implications of that. There's some, very clear, some companies that will be impacted directly, notably TSMC. So, Brady and I will kind of talk through that, and also the implications for Huawei, what it might be planning for its Kirin line of chipsets, and how it can counter that. So we'll get into the discussion now. So Brady, what's your kind of immediate takeaway? I know you've just written and published a blog on this. So who do you think are going to be the main guys that get hit by this new ruling by the US?
Thanks, Peter. I think, yes, you are right. I think TSMC will suffer some, and also, but however, Huawei, it will big problem for Huawei, right? So, yeah, I think in general, if TSMC stop the productions of a new chipset for Huawei, it's fatal to Huawei, right?
So TSMC has been the main foundry for Huawei's high silicon products. Is that right?
Yes, you are right. Yeah.
So do we know, roughly what sort of percentage of TSMC's revenues and profit comes from Huawei?
In last year, I think it's around 10% to 15% because of the US-China trade war. I think high silicons belong to Huawei put a lot of deal to orders to TSMC last year. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I know that, I've been sort of following Huawei and their high silicon products pretty closely, and they've really been, some of the earliest users of the developments in the process node that TSMC has been developing. So, when TSMC moved to 7 nanometer, I think Huawei was one of the first to take advantage of that. Is that your understanding as well?
Yes, you are right. Actually, not just the 7 nanometers. In 16 nanometers, Huawei is the first one to use that. And also, Huawei is the first one to use the EUV solutions of 7 nanometers from TSMC. So, Huawei is always a good partner with TSMC to develop the advanced technologies.
Yeah. So when I kind of look back at this time last year, when the US first added Huawei to its entity list, there was an expectation that Huawei would be, significantly impacted, but that doesn't really seem to have happened. I mean, there has of course been a pretty significant drop in Huawei's market share, particularly outside China, but it's been able to counter that by growing its smartphone market share inside China. But on the network side, and obviously we're kind of getting into this rollout of 5G in China right now, it doesn't really seem to have been severely impacted. And I think from when we kind of look at the smartphone impact, it's probably the biggest impact has actually come much more from Huawei's inability to use the Google mobile services, so the GMS services within Android. But it seems to have been able to continue, developing its own chipsets, and I think it's been able to either obtain licenses from, or the US companies that export to Huawei have been able to obtain licenses. So, do you think that this, really has a material impact, or do you think that, these licenses will continue to be issued by the US authorities? So, it becomes more of a threat than an actual harm. That's what I'm sort of struggling to see right now.
Yeah, I believe so. I think in the past, Huawei rely on TSMC, and because TSMC own the most of the technologies, they rely on the manufacturing equipment from the US company. However, they develop the process, the technology by themselves, right? So they still can produce the chips for Huawei, right? However, the rule changes in the past few days, right? Now U.S. government actually is require TSMC to stop Huawei to use TSMC technologies because TSMC use the technology from U.S. company, right? So the rule has changed.
So it's the fact that TSMC uses capital equipment from companies like Applied Materials and Lam Research. So that's the kind of aspect that the US government's going after.
Yes.
So so thinking about Huawei, so it that um, there is a period. I think it's 120 days, right, before this is uh, the ban comes into force. So what will Huawei do in these 120 days?
Actually, 120 days is actually not enough. The cycle times of the 5 nanometers and the 7 nanometers, it's around almost 4 months, right? So if the product is 12 nanometers or 16 nanometers for other chips, the cycle time could be 2.5 months, right? So yeah, and also the capacity of 5 nanometers and 7 nanometers is limited, right? So I believe TSMC cannot give the priority to Huawei because they also need to meet the requirement of the other customers like Apple, right? We all know Apple is the biggest customers of TSMC, right? So, and also Apple is urging to launch their new smartphone with the new SoC, right? So I don't think Huawei can finish all of the product with 7 nanometer or 5 nanometers within 120 days, right? However, of course, they can still finish some, but yeah, the production cannot be continuous. Okay.
So TSMC, I think you say in your blog, will be in a situation where it can't accept new orders from Huawei, so it'll have to kind of use this period to work through wafer inventory within that period. But it looks like that, for example, the next iteration of the Kirin series, presumably the Kirin 1000 or whatever it's going to be called, would typically be launched in the September timeframe. So that would seem to be, and that's likely to be on the 5 nanometer process, right? So that looks like that would be, difficult to make happen now.
Yeah, even they can produce some Kirin 1000 series processor for Huawei, right? But the amount of finished good will be still limited, right? So which means if Huawei still launch the new smartphone with Kirin 1000 series, they will say, okay, it's a limited version. They can only ship around a few thousands of the new smartphone, right? But yeah, it doesn't make sense, right? So yeah, it's a problems for Huawei as well.
So I guess looking at Huawei's smartphone business, so a lot of its products, I would say, in fact, all of its mid and high range products have been based on high silicon application processors. So I guess there's a question of whether Huawei can switch to using merchant solutions from, I don't know, Qualcomm or MediaTek or Samsung. I guess even in that case, it would, Qualcomm, for example, would still need to apply for a license to ship to Huawei in that case, and it's not a straightforward task to swap out your one application processor for another. It requires a complete redesign of the whole system. So that doesn't seem to be an immediate solution. But do you think that would be possible under these new limitations by the US government?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it could be possible. However, we know Huawei want to roll out the solutions from the US companies, right? So Qualcomm definitely is not their first choice, right? So I think they may choose the others like NTK or Samsung, right? But it still depends on American government. If they say, okay, MTK and Samsung cannot get a license to provide chips for Huawei, then Huawei will have nothing, right? But it all depends on the attitudes of the US government.
Yeah. So on the smartphone side, it looks pretty difficult for Huawei to carry on the momentum that it's been building. And I guess the other aspect, which is very interesting to me, is on the infrastructure side. So Huawei has been able to carry on building base station solutions and has been a big part of the rollout of 5G in many markets in Europe and Asia, notwithstanding some of the other security issues that have arisen around the use of Huawei. Particularly in China, which is rolling out 5G very fast. And Huawei has about, I think, 50% of the orders for infrastructure to build out uh, Chinese operators' 5G infrastructure. So that also now seems to be in doubt because a lot of the technology that Huawei uses in those in that equipment is also based on pretty advanced semiconductor processes, and TSMC is a big part of that as well, right?
Yeah, I think it's the restrictions will also impact the development of China's 5G plan, right? And also affect the chips for 5G infrastructures, as you say. Because Huawei is one of the leading solution provider for the 5G infrastructure, right? And as you say, they took more than 50% of the new deals in China. So it will not be easy to quickly switch to the other solutions, right?
Yeah, and I think other infrastructure providers in China, ZTE, Datang, and maybe some of the Europeans, Nokia, Ericsson, for example. I think they have much lower. They've received much lower awards of contracts to build the infrastructure there. But also, I don't think they have the same sort of capacity to, before this restriction was imposed, to build network capability. So I'm just sort of thinking through the potential for what happens in the broader sense if 5G does get delayed in China, because as we said earlier, Apple is likely to launch 5G based iPhones later this year, and Apple actually has decent market share in China. So there could be, if 5G is delayed in China, it can have this sort of ripple effect, which is going to bounce back on some of the US companies as well.
Yes, but again, I think it's geopolitical issues, right? It's a gaming between the big countries, right? So we don't know, what will be going on and for their next step, right? So yeah, as you say, it will also hurt the business of US company, right? So I think they may negotiate to find out the solutions. Yeah. So yeah, we should see what happenings in the next step, right?
So, if Huawei can't use TSMC, and I presume it also won't be able to use some of the other foundries because of the essentially the same situation. And as I understand it, the you know Chinese domicile, so companies that that could build for Huawei within China. Uh, there's companies like SMIC, but I don't think they are at the same level of development as TSMC, right?
Yes, in order to diversify the risk, Huawei gave SMIC a chance to produce chips, right? SMIC received order from Huawei and also the financial support from the China National Fund. However, in addition to the investment and the monies, the production of chips also require a large number of products to verify the manufacturing steps and also improve the yield, right? So that's why Huawei gave SMIC an opportunity to produce their chips. However, as you say, SMIC and the TSMC are not in the same level of technologies, right? So I think it's almost impossible for some SMIC to replace TSMC in the next few years.
Right, right. So, if TSMC cannot continue uh, taking orders from Huawei, who might benefit from that? Presumably, Huawei's been taking quite a bit of capacity that TSMC has, particularly on these advanced process nodes. So, who might who might benefit from that in terms of getting that extra capacity to their side?
Since 5 nanometers and 7 nanometers in TSMC are fully utilized. It means, yeah. So if Huawei is ruled out, and I believe the other vendors are very very happy to jump in. Like for example, the AMDs, for example, the MDKs, right?
So AMD could potentially benefit, but MediaTek, I mean, they've been a little bit sort of slower to 5G solutions, but are now launching. But I think historically they've tended to use more mature technologies rather than being at the bleeding edge of process node development. Is that a fair summary of MediaTek's strategy?
Yes, I think in order to save some cost, they prefer to use mature technologies. Now, 7 nanometers is quite mature for TSMC, right? But a lot of clients, customers are waiting waiting in the line, right? So if the Huawei cannot get the capacity from TSMCs, I believe MDK can benefit from that.
Yeah. So, just as we kind of wrap up the discussion, the Chinese state has been, fairly quiet, really. You know, to my view, at least, they've been fairly quiet about this. I mean, the U.S. has, there's clearly been this sort of war of words between Chinese government and the U.S. government, particularly around the coronavirus situation, and a kind of a ratcheting up of the tensions also on the trade war. And this the action by the US government against Huawei feels like a part of the weapons that the US are using in this trade war. And as I say, China doesn't seem to have, they seem to be quite patient, maybe hoping that the US will perhaps use this as a bargaining chip in the trade war. But you know, um, in what ways do you think that China could retaliate? How might they kind of play this to to get back at the US?
It's a good question, but I don't think they have much weapons or methods to retaliate. We heard that they may Apple or Qualcomm, right? But the retaliations against Apple will directly impact on many component suppliers or EMS in China, right? And also, Qualcomm remains the major SoC suppliers for high-end smartphone, right? The retaliations against Qualcomm will also hurt the competitiveness of the Chinese smartphone OEMs, right? So yeah, it's about the technologies. The gap between the two countries is still a lot. I cannot say huge, but still a large gap here there, right? So I think they have limited weapons for this right now.
Okay, so maybe the Chinese play the long game and hope that the US election in November will yield a different administration, which might take a slightly softer view, perhaps. But I guess we'll just have to wait and see on that one. Anyway, Brady, it's been great talking to you today. Thanks for your insights. And yeah, so please do check out Brady's blog post, which is now published on our website. And thanks for listening, and look forward to talking with you on our next Counterpoint podcast. Thanks. Have a good day.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, it's my honor.